What's going on, class? So here is your video for 2.5 and 2.6. I'm just going to jump right into it and start sharing my screen and just share, always going back to our framework, because that's the most important thing that we're going to be working on. And just kind of talking about in general. So 2.5, slave auctions and the domestic slave trade. Wednesday, excuse me, before break, I made sure that I kind of went over some of the documents and sources that were in 2.5. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit and just talk about the EQs and the learning objective. And so our LO for this lesson is, or we have two of them, excuse me, describe the nature of slave auctions in the 19th century United States South. The second one, explain how African American authors advanced the causes of abolition and equality with their writings about slave auctions. All right, and our essential knowledge for this one, enslavers leveraged the power of law and white supremacist doctrine to assault the bodies, minds, and spirits of enslaved Africans and their descendants. At some auctions, those who resisted sale were punished severely by whippings, at times in front of their families and their friends. And so, I'm happy that I get to teach about slavery and not just in a very cliche way. But when you do a lot of the research behind it, it's just a horrible, horrible institution. And it did a lot of damage to African American families, and some of those effects can still be felt to this day. And so, just kind of reading some of the documents and the sources, it's just kind of like this is very, very heavy. And though I'm happy to be able to teach about it, it's also just sad that our people had to go through these things. All right, our second EK, or central knowledge, African American writers use various literary genres, including narratives and poetry, to articulate the physical and emotional effects they experience from being sold at auctions into unknown territory. So once again, a lot of the previous one was talking about the unknown, the middle passage, when people will be abducted, taken to those areas where the door of no return and things like that, and they wouldn't be able to go back home. There was a lot of unknown from when they were getting on that ship to what they were actually going to land to, or what was going to happen once they got to that place. So this kind of continues on with that as well. Like when you're sold and separated from your family, like at an auction, it's a lot of unknown. One, if you're separated from your family, what happens to your kids? What happens to your husband? What happens to, or your wife, or whatever those things are, whoever it is that ends up being sold. And just like the ripple effects of that, it's a lot, like I said, a lot of unknown. And then also going into a new plantation or with the new owner, you don't know what's going to happen to you, how if it's going to be tougher than the previous place that you've been, or even like you don't know any of those things. So once again, the unknown is kind of the narrative and the theme that I'm picking up on with the second topic, excuse me. And our third EQ, African American writers sought to counter enslavers' claims that slavery was a benign institution to advance the causes of abolition. So when we think about benign, we think about cancer, benign or tumor, excuse me. A benign tumor is really like a tumor that is not not malignant. It doesn't have cancer in it. It's just kind of appearing, but it's not necessarily growing or spreading or going to cause you any kind of long-term issues, supposedly. But it's still a tumor. Um, and so it's still growing. It can still cause damage. It can still cause issues. So there's nothing benign about it. Like the same way about slavery in terms of like, it's still a tumor. It's still an issue. And there's no way to make nice about people being enslaved and not having self accountability or what's the word I'm looking for? Self determination. Excuse me, where they're not able to look after themselves and create their own lessons, their own families, their own histories, their own whatever, because they're forced to be three-fifths of a person during enslavement times. All right, I'll hop back over to these in a moment once I go into our videos, or excuse me, our PowerPoint. All right. All right, so I'm just gonna move forward a little bit. And speaking of just kind of like the unknown, we have Solomon Northup, once again, the person who wrote 12 Years a Slave, which turned into a movie. Once again, he was a free African American musician and engineer who was captured and illegally sold into slavery on the cotton plantation in Louisiana. And he's going to give his eyewitness account of a slave auction and just kind of the experience that he is going to have. Um, yeah, it's pretty. I mean, since you guys read it, you guys know it's pretty deep. It talks about a mother being separated from her two children, and like really just being super emotional and wanting and pleading and begging for the person who just bought her to buy the rest of her, to buy her two children as well. Just kind of like saying, I'll be the best slave you ever had. I'll do X, Y, Z. But unfortunately, that wasn't able to be. So once again, that unknown theme of what's going to happen to her children, what's going to happen to her, will she ever reconnect with them, things like that. But also having the account from someone who's been kidnapped back to slavery, excuse me, or kidnapped into slavery, who was free is definitely interesting as well. So let me hop over to our 2.5 worksheet, which I know that you guys should have already finished. And so hopefully you guys explain the significance of Northwest perspective, purpose, context, and audience. All of those things should be addressed and identified. And make sure you're incorporating the learning objectives in the EKs to help you explain the purpose, content, and audience. Yeah, all right, so moving on and moving down. The next one was this video about the slave auction. And it just, you just kind of feel a sense of the narrative of what's happening and like the experiences that are going on. And so with this, I hope that you were able to respond to the short answer questions and longer than one sentence, what I expect. Um, all right, so I'm going to bounce back over to our AP framework, and I'm going to keep on going with the learning methods and the EKs. So we're going to explain how the growth of the cotton industry in the United States displaced enslaved African American families. And so once again, the boom of cotton and just being able to grow it in the South is going to create a movement or kind of a second middle passage that we're going to learn about in the Henry Louis Gates video that's coming up a little bit later in this worksheet that you guys hopefully have already completed. And so that second middle passage was like the biggest forced migration of African people, in this nation. And so just seeing how that movement, once again, the auctions, the selling, the unknown, how those things are going to impact African American families. And so the essential knowledge that's kind of connected with that learning objective is after the United States government formally banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the enslaved population grew primarily through childbirth rather than new importations to meet the growing demand for enslaved agricultural laborers. So once again, as I said previously, they had a lot of importation that was happening, but now it just kind of becomes like kind of a breeding form of slavery where they're trying to get more people, more workers, more employees. And you'll see like the violation of African American women's bodies and African Americans men's as well, just kind of to force them to procreate or just dealing with sexual assault or things like that. And all for the cotton. And so also just understanding that majority of that cotton is not going to be bought in America. It's going to be shipped over to Europe. And it's going to really, and that's really what's going to change. Europe's demand for American cotton changes our slavery, even though Europe is phasing out slavery much earlier than the United States will. All right, the lower South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas was dominated by a slave cotton system in which enslaved African Americans were especially valuable as commodities because of the demand for enslaved labor. So once again, the growth of that cotton industry. And you can go to any of these states to this day and drive by fields full of cotton where they are still growing cotton. It's quite a blast from the past, but it's still just also an industry that is, so people still make money off of those things, even though it has a very racist and painful and a harmful connection with African Americans. All right, so during the cotton boom in the first half of the 19th century, many African Americans were forcibly relocated through domestic slave trade from the upper South, including states like Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, into the lower South, the states that are up here, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So once again, that second middle passage that I spoke of and that I spoke of in the Henry Louis Gates video, the 2-minute clip. And finally, marching hundreds of miles, over 1 million African Americans were displaced at the Second Middle Passage. Over 2.5 times more people than arrived that had, excuse me, more than 2.5 times more people than had arrived from Africa during the original Middle Passage. This massive displacement was the largest forced migration in American history. So we know that later on the US is going to have the Trail of Tears, but they had like decimated Native American populations by then. But once again, the African American population is growing because they're importing for a while, and then after that, they're just growing the population through childbirth. So pop down to some of the things that we're looking at. So our sources, we're going to see a broadside for auction for enslaved people at Charleston Courthouse. And so you can just kind of see the names, the ages of these people, and all of these people are going to be sold or up for auction um, in Charleston, South Carolina, which is one of the main places in which Middle Passage ships, basically docked and got most of their slaves off of. And so we looked at this deeply, thoroughly, I think, in class, and we just kind of noted the ages, the numbers, the names, and if people had names, and things like that. All right, so those are the two sources, just reading about Solomon Northup, and then looking at the slave auction, excuse me, slave auction document. And then our other sources that I showed you all in the PowerPoint for 2.4 and 2.5, just showed other editions or other versions of different slave auction announcements and things like that. All right. So we're eventually going to move down here to 2.6, which is labor, culture, and economy. But I'm going to bounce back over to our PowerPoint one more time. And so once again, Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave. Just the movie's crazy. The reading is, in my opinion, very impactful, very emotional. And I can understand why this writing was able to convince abolitionists people to become abolitionists and work towards ending the enslavement practice in the United States. Well, kind of. All right, so once again, this is a zoomed in version of the auction roll, and you guys can see once again the names of people, the ages of people, even the infant that is 9 months that is right here that is unnamed, and things like that. All right, and so also, we have the auction announcements, and so we talked about these in class as well. So looking at the cargo for 94 prime healthy Negroes, and just talking about how many women, boys, and girls and men they're going to be there. And then the other one also talking about 17 valuable young Negroes, men and women. And just this was like the norm. This was not abnormal. This was expected to happen. And this is how they were able to, get money because they used Black bodies as commodities. All right, and so you guys were aptly able to figure out that this is from Atlanta. So this is going to be an Atlanta auction. This is real. These things happened all throughout the South. People were literally, you know, sold on a storefront or right at the front of town or in the middle of downtown or things like that. And it was absolutely normal. All right, and so we read, hopefully you all watched the video about the Second Middle Passage with Henry Louis Gates. I think it was a really awesome video and just really talk about the movement of people, the displacement of people, and what happens. Okay. All right. And so we're looking at the slave trade, and you can see let's look at this map for a second. Let's break it down for a moment. So this says the domestic slave trade from 1808 to 1865. So um, from the end of the Slave Trade Act, where the beginning, excuse me, of the Slave Trade Act, where you're no longer able to import enslaved African people, to the end of slavery in 1865. So almost 60 years later. And what you'll see is a lot of migration of enslaved Africans from the upper South, as they were saying previously, to right here, the lower South and around and things like that. So where cotton was booming and things like that. And so you can also see the slave population in the South, the Upper South, excuse me, and it gives you the time periods as well. So 1860s, all that. And so then This is the slave population once it is a free state. Um, uh, hold on, let me. Alrighty, so let's look at this map and see how this map helped us or hopefully helps you all with task 6. So we're looking at it and it's just showing you the migration from the upper south, as they were calling it in this region, all the way through the lower south, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, places like that. And so we see all of the movement that's going to happen, but you also can see the growth of enslaved people. So we're looking at it in 1790, there's about 500,000 enslaved people. But then by the 1860s, you have almost 1.5 million enslaved people. And then if you look at the free population, it's pretty much static or it's not moving all that much. But you can get up to 500,000 freed, formerly enslaved or freed Africans by the 1860s. So that's also a growth, but it's happening in the upper South. And then if we look down at the slave population in the lower South, we're going to see it skyrockets. Crazy. So it's going to start off literally around zero in the 1790s. And then you see a huge jump by 1860s. They're at almost 2.5 million enslaved African um, people. So you can see like that's a gigantic and a massive like growth. And this is all happening. So if we look, so 1810 is going to essentially be the time in which the Slave Trade Act goes through in that area. And then you just see the magnificent or the crazy, 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 crazy boom that happens from childbirth with a lot of enslaved African women. And so once again, you see the movement from the upper South through the lower South as cotton is changing slavery during this time period. All right, so let me get out of this PowerPoint. And so now I'm going to pop over. Yes, can finally close this. Can finally close this too. All right, and so once again, this is the worksheet. So you're supposed to look at the video about the slave auction by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper from 1857 and respond to these 5 questions. And then the final part, you're supposed to be looking at the video with Henry Louis Gates. And then we're just tracking the domestic slave trade between the 1820s and the 1860s. So around the time in which 10 years after the Slave Trade Act was passed, and then 5 years before slavery was ended. And so it's just quite interesting. All right. And so for this one, we're going to use the evidence from the video and the 12 Years a Slave excerpt, class sessions, and source charts below from a historian, and the essential knowledge, excuse me, below to articulate a fabulously scholarly paragraph with 2 or 3 excuse me, a scholarly paragraph or 2 or 3. So hopefully we'll be able to get through that. So I'm thinking about our DBQ as well. I think we're gonna have to work on that in class. I don't think that it's a good idea to work on the DBQ away from you guys. And so we'll do that when we come back from break on the second, third, or the fourth. All right, so close this worksheet down too. All right, so let's go back over to our framework. Once again, the most important thing in the class is essentially the framework. So once again, Unit 2 is about freedom, enslavement, and resistance. And so topic 2.6 is labor, culture, and the economy. So we'll be looking at sugarcane harvest, Antigua, West Indies, 1823. It's going to be put out in 1826. We're going to be looking at a broadside advertisement for valuable slaves at auction in New Orleans from 1859. And then finally, the rice banner basket, created around 1863. So our learning objective, describe the range and variety of specialized roles performed by enslaved people. Um, yeah, enslaved people did everything. They did more than the European Americans who quote unquote owned them. So the skilled workers were actually the enslaved people. European Americans didn't really know how to do much for themselves. They didn't cook, they didn't till their fields, they didn't clean. Um, they didn't wash their clothes. I mean, it's just so many things they didn't do, but they just utilized Black bodies. Even the women, some of them didn't breastfeed. These Black women, they called them wet nurses. They were, basically, didn't really participate in the kind of the rearing or the feeding of their children. They just passed it along to an enslaved woman who either had just had a child or was still breastfeeding with one of the children. So our EKs, enslaved people of all ages and genders, performed a wide variety of domestic, agricultural, and skilled labor in both urban and rural locales. Excuse me. So once again, I mean, like blacksmithing, farming, um, training horses, like I said, any number of things that you can think of that would make a society run in the 1800s or the 19th century is essentially what enslaved African people were doing. So once again, a lot of the skilled tasks and things like that were performed mostly by African American people who were enslaved and not necessarily by the Europeans who were using their bodies. So once again, so no matter whether you're in a rural area or an urban area, kind of the city, um, your skills and the skilled labor is definitely still needed. All right, so in some areas, there were distinct roles separating domestic and agricultural laborers, although enslaved African people could be relocated to another type of labor according to preferences of their enslaver. So once again, if you are enslaved, you have no control over your body. Your owner can do with you as they choose. So let's say that you're a blacksmith, and you're making, metal things or making keys or whatever those things are, and your owner wants to sell you to someone who, a cotton plantation. Well, I mean, now you're going to go pick cotton or, whatever the specialty is needed for you there, you're going to do those things, which seems like crazy, but these things like really, really happened. And also just understanding too that, let's say for instance, someone passes away, the European American can leave a will and that they can basically leave different enslaved people to their children, to their family, to whomever. And so what one plantation owner did is not necessarily going to be what the other plantation owner is going to do as well. All right, some enslaved people were bound to institutions such as churches, factories, colleges, rather than the individual person. So a great example of this is going to be Georgetown University. So it's a college that was founded by the Jesuits. So that's a Catholic organization, it's a Catholic institution. And so at first it was believed that, um, enslaved African people kind of worked there, like helped to design it, helped to build it, and they were like embraced by the community. And later on, it was discovered through doing a lot of history records and things like that, that the Jesuits actually sold a fair amount of their enslaved people to keep the school open. Um, and so, like I said, it wasn't just people owning enslaved people. You had churches, you had factories, and you had colleges. Some colleges that are still around to this day. Yeah. All right. And next, many enslaved Africans brought skills to the Americas, including blacksmithing. So once again, metallurgy, or being able to utilize metal and turn it into whatever you need, basket weaving, and the cultivation of rice and indigo. Enslavers exploited these valuable skills, as well as specialization many African Americans developed as painters, carpenters, tailors, musicians, and healers. In the face of such commodification, African Americans used these skills to survive, create culture, and to build community. So I'm going to stop there for a second and pop over to our PowerPoint. So once again, 2.6 is about labor, culture, and economy. So how our labor influenced our culture and also influenced the American economy. So these are, once again, our sources are right here. This is going to be our worksheet. So a lot of the worksheet essentially is going to be you responding to just questions about the reading, number one, and then two, about the two videos that are there as well. All right. So once again, this is an advertisement for valuable slaves from New Orleans, which is also going to be something that you guys are going to respond to. Um, yeah, it just once again, it gives you the names of the people, how old they are, what their skills are. So once again, it's not just the previous one that we saw, where it's just a name and age. This one's also listing what they're able to do. So this is a different level of slave auction where it's more specialized for whatever labor practices are needed. Um, yeah. All right. So just going to keep on going with the EKs because it associates with this. So enslaved people of all ages and genders performed a wide variety of, okay, went over that one before. Okay. So essentially, all of those things have been gone over when I read over them previously. And here is another slave auction. And you guys can hopefully blow that up and just see that it's talking not only their names, their ages, but once again, also what they are capable of doing and what their specialized skill in labor was. And so once again, it's still that hypocritical kind of narrative that is being taught where it's, African American people need to be enslaved so they can have support, they can do XYZ. But you can see that they are already skilled. They don't really need anyone's help to be more skilled. They just need their freedom to be able to utilize their bodies and actually make money from them and not be commodified by, a European American slave owner. All right. And so here is a rice spinner basket circa 1863. So we can look at this basket. It conveys the transfer of agricultural and artistic knowledge from Africa to the United States. The quote features of African American basket making traditions in the Carolina Low Countries resembles current basket making in Senegal and Angola. So right in that southern South the Carolina region, they have some islands off of the coast. They're called the Geechee Islands. And so the Geechee Islands have Geechee people and Gullah people as well. Those people, for once they were freed from slavery, created a town called Africa Town, in which they, literally had direct descendants who were still alive from Africa. Some of them who came over on the Clotilda, which is going to be the final. Well, we don't know, but one of the final slave ships that's going to come into the United States after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1807. So it's going to be much, much later after 1807, in which there's going to be a secret ship that brings in African people. And they end up burning the ship to kind of hide the evidence. The ship has now been found over the last like 5 or 6 years or so. They know where the ship actually sank and all those things. But they were able to kind of sneak or try to. But there ended up being a trial for these things where it was discovered that, what had happened. But anyway, so Africa Town ended up being a place where some of those people from the Clotilda, the last slave ship, or one of the last slave ships that's going to come in from Africa, much later than the Slave Trade Act. And they're going to kind of just bond together in that area, and they're going to keep a lot of African traditions. So that's why you can see connections between Carolina Low Country and also basket weaving from Senegal and Angola because they kept those traditions up. The syncretism, they knew were needed for agriculture, and they once again are going to bring their artistic knowledge to make them sturdy, strong, and beautiful. And we can see this is from the 1800s, so almost 200 years ago, and it is still in very good condition. All right, so we can look at this sugarcane harvest, Antigua, West Indies, 1823. This is going to be a picture of sugarcane. And so I told you guys previously, sugarcane was one of the hardest crops to grow and be responsible for. People who started off like in Brazil, they went there probably in their early teenage years, like 14, 15, 16, and they usually only made it to 23. So that's like a 7 year, 8 year lifespan. If you were doing sugarcane just wholeheartedly. And so it's very rough because once you cut all the sugarcane, it has to be harvested immediately or it starts to come back, which is a waste of your crops. And once you start harvesting all of it, once you start harvesting one thing, you have to harvest all of it all at the same time. This is kind of an example of the amount of physical labor and needs that were there when people were, when enslaved people, when plantations, were growing sugar. This is going to be in the West Indies, so not in the United States, but in the Caribbean. Yes. All right, so enslaved Agricultural laborers often worked in a gang system or a task system. So once again, you can see the order, they're moving together, and they're just going to like knock these things down in their presence, and they're going to have people behind them who are going to pick the sugar cane up and then start to process it and all those things. The gang system and slave laborers worked in groups, from groups to sun up to sundown, and that's basically the time period. So when the sun was up, they were out working. When the sun went down, they stopped working. Um, yeah. So think about summertime. The sun's coming up like 5 in the morning. It's not going down until like 8:30, 9 o'clock. So they're working that whole entire time. All right. Under the watch and discipline of an overseer, as they cultivated crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco, enslaved people worked in gangs, created work songs in English with syncopated rhythms to keep the pace of work. So they would do like different like Negro spirituals or things like that. So they would be able to kind of keep their pace, and then also just break up the monotony of doing the same thing over and over and over again, as well as the abuse and the heat and the lack of food and to all of those things. So in the task system, enslaved people worked individually until they met a daily quota, generally with less supervision. The task system was used for the cultivation of crops like rice and indigo. With less oversight, some enslaved people maintained linguistic practices such as Gullah Creole, language that developed in the Carolina Low Country. So as I was saying previously, the Geechee and the Gullah people, they have their own form of Creole. Creole is going to be that mixture of English, some African, well, in this instance, it's going to be some African linguistics, some of that Bantu linguistics, as well as probably other cultures that are mixed in there as well. But that Creole is still around and it's still spoken in that Gullah area, the Geechee area. And that's really, 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 really important cultural practice that unfortunately is fading away as people move away from the Gullah Geechee Islands, and as people, the elders are passing away, who speak the Gullah Creole. Okay, so alrighty, let's move on. I think that actually might be it. So I'm gonna bounce over to our worksheet. So task number one, we're going to be looking at the sugarcane harvest, that task system, and the broadside advertisement. So all of those things are going to be, or already, excuse me, in a folder. It's at 2.6 with your worksheet, PowerPoint, and worksheet, PowerPoint, and your sources. They're all going to be posted up there. So once again, you're going to be supporting a claim or argument using specific relevant evidence. Below are the selected EKs, each of which make a claim. You are to indicate whether one, two, or three of those sources could be used to support the EK and briefly explain why. So once again, we have three sources: the painting, we have the broadside advertisement in New Orleans showing the skilled task, and then we have the rice banner basket. And so you're going to once again look at these EKs and see which one, two, or three of the sources support the EKs, and then you're going to explain why. So enslaved African people of all ages, genders performed a wide variety of domestic, agricultural, and skilled labor in both urban and rural locales. You know, I'm looking probably at a New Orleans slave auction, at least for one of those things. And so you're going to keep on going down and just respond to that in that way. All right, and so each one of these all have videos attached to them. And so you're going to watch these videos. Each one is about 2 minutes long, and you're going to create new EKs using, excuse me, you are to create new essential knowledges using the videos below. So you guys once again find those all on Google Classroom. And so you're just going to say, hey, what essential knowledge you guys can use one of these or some of these. You all have, once again, these all throughout here, your framework. You guys can check those out. There's so many different versions of those. Um, where are we at? Okay, that 2.6, perfect. Okay, and so we're gonna watch the videos and just check out ways that we can create 3 new EKs. That is essentially it. All right, so your next task, several short videos, historians discussing the effects of slavery on modern economy. So your skill for this one, you're gonna identify and explain the source's claim, evidence, and reasoning. So once again, another set of videos that are only about 2 minutes long. And so you're going to look through all these and you're going to check them out. And once again, identify and explain. So once again, when you look at the task verb sheet to remember what those two things mean, identify and explain the source's claim, evidence, and reasoning. Okay. And that is close to the end. And now, and rolling down just a little bit, this is going to be the last one. So below are 3 EKs. Please briefly explain which videos support EKs with at least 1 to 2 sentences. So once again, these videos up here, which ones are supported, which ones are supporting which EK. I'm going to let you all figure that out. I hope you guys can. And I think I have talked way too much. So I'm going to stop and put you guys stuff up there. Have a wonderful rest of your break. And so I'll be posting a video tomorrow about your um, not video, excuse me, about your projects, your AP African American projects that are 10% of your test score. So that's coming up tomorrow. So have a wonderful rest of your day. And please get this work done by Sunday, 11:59. All right, bye guys.